Jane Austen conjures up images of elegant drawing rooms, picnics, and ladies and gentlemen dancing at balls. It's not a name that usually makes us think of murder and mayhem, crime and gruesome punishments, but they are there in the writings of Jane Austen. So let me take you on a journey through the murder in her life and in her fiction, the murderous wishes of some of her characters, and the way in which she uses crime quite brilliantly within her novels. In his Dictionary of the English Language, Dr. Samuel Johnson gave an entire column of printed space to the act of murder, much more than a modern standard dictionary would give to explain the word. Johnson illustrated murder, murderer, murderess, murderess with quotes from Dryden, Shakespeare, Milton, Addison and John Donne. He even included the old-fashioned word murderment along with a 16th century quote. Now, no person of the Georgian era would have been surprised to see the word murder so fully explained and defined in a dictionary. Murder was all too much a part of Georgian life. There were cutthroats waiting in dark streets. There were highwaymen who might not only rob you of your purse, but your life as well. There were housebreakers who, when surprised, could easily take your life. Jane Austen was very aware that murder was around her in the Georgian world. There was even murder in royal circles. In the year 1810, Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, claimed to have been attacked by a would-be killer. Now, it was all rather mysterious. His page, a man called Sellis, was found with his throat cut, and it was claimed that Sellis had taken his own life. But he was left-handed, and he could not have done this to himself. There seemed no obvious culprit when it came to this murder, and possibly there had been a homosexual relationship between the Duke and his servant. In the end, a suicide verdict was brought in to avoid royal scandal, but it was fairly clear that the Duke knew far more than he should have about what was going on. In the year 1811, the Ratcliffe Highway murders gripped the nation and absolutely terrified people. These took place in the East End, and the first lot of murders was at a place called Mars Mercer's shop, when a hosier, his wife, and his baby child were all slaughtered, along with their apprentice. A little later on, a landlord, his wife, and his daughter were also bloodily slaughtered. So all of this was reported in the papers. There was absolute panic about it. And in the end, a man called John Williams was caught for the crime. He ended up committing suicide before he could be hanged, and his funeral was held in front of 180,000 people in London. So Jane Austen would certainly have known about the Ratcliffe Highway murders. She even ended up meeting a man who got murdered. Her brother, Henry Austen, was friendly with a French couple, the Comte and Comtesse d'Entraigues. She was an opera singer, he was a political intriguer and a secret agent. Now, in July 1812, just over a year after Jane Austen had met this couple, the Comte and his wife were found murdered in their home in Barnes in Surrey. They had been killed by their Italian manservant, who then took his own life. But almost certainly it was to do with the political intrigues that the Comte was involved in. Jane Austen even lived in the time of the murder of a British Prime Minister, in fact the only British Prime Minister to have been assassinated. Spencer Perceval was killed in 1812 in the lobby of the House of Commons. Murder was amongst the very last words he was able to gasp out, and Spencer Perceval left behind a widow and 12 children. He was killed by a man called John Bellingham, who was wanting compensation for something, and in the end got so frustrated he decided to kill Spencer Perceval. Now, Jane Austen does feature murder in her fiction, and it begins in her juvenilia, so obviously the young writer was rather fascinated by the idea of unlawful killings. In her delightful A Letter from a Young Lady, she writes of a young woman called Anna Parker, and it's a very entertaining and rather astonishing story. In fact, the full title is A Letter from a Young Lady whose feelings being too strong for her judgment led her into the commission of errors which her heart disapproved. And this is how the story begins. I murdered my father at a very early period of my life. I have since murdered my mother, and I am now going to murder my sister. I have changed my religion so often that at present I have not an idea of any left. I have been a perjured witness in every public trial for these last 12 years, and I have forged my own will. In short, there is scarcely a crime that I have not committed. Now, we have no idea why Anna Parker has committed all of these murders, or why she has wanted to forge her own will, a rather delightful touch. Jane Austen, of course, is using murder in this story for comic purposes. We have no sense that Anna is repenting of any of her crimes. The same thing happens in her little story, Sir William Montague. Sir William is in love, and he ends up murdering his rival in love, a man called Mr. Stanhope. After staying at the village a few weeks longer, Sir William left it and went to a friend's house in Surrey. Mr. Brudenell was a sensible man and had a beautiful niece with whom Sir William soon fell in love. But Miss Arundel was cruel. She preferred a Mr. Stanhope. Sir William shot Mr. Stanhope. The lady had then no reason to refuse him. She accepted him, and they were to be married on the 27th of October. Once again, murder in this story is for comic purposes. We also find murder in Jack and Alice, where a young woman called Sukey Simpson is very jealous indeed of 17-year-old Lucy, who is her rival in love, and so Sukey poisons Lucy. Sukey is actually punished for her crime. We are told that Sukey was speedily raised to the gallows. Jane Austen knew that the gallows were the punishment for murder in her era. But what does she do with murder in her more mature novels? There, murder, of course, can no longer be comic. But she does look at characters who wish for murder, even if they don't actually commit it. Naughty Lady Susan suggests to her friend Alicia that maybe she should kill off Mrs. Mannering, because Lady Susan wants to marry him herself. And when Sir James Martin makes Lady Susan very angry, she says, I could have poisoned him. And it's quite easy to picture Lady Susan using a little vial of poison and adding it to Sir James's wine. In Mansfield Park, when Tom Bertram falls ill, Mary Crawford writes to Fanny Price. She, of course, is keener on Tom's younger brother. She knows that if Tom dies, then Edmund will become Sir Edmund Bertram. And she makes little jokes about rather hoping that perhaps Tom might die. Then she says to Fanny, oh, I never bribed a physician in my life. But the thoughts are there, and they do make us think the worse of Mary Crawford. Tom Bertram himself, in the same novel, rather hopes that Dr. Grant will die. He's feeling guilty because the living has been given to Dr. Grant instead of saved for his younger brother, and this is all because of Tom's own extravagance. So Tom imagines the death of Dr. Grant with great relish and optimism. Plied well with good things, he would soon pop off, Tom asserts. And we do hear in the same novel that Mrs. Grant cannot deny her husband all of those good things, and he does pop off before too long. Sir Walter Elliot, in Persuasion, is quite in favour of compulsory euthanasia for anybody who is not physically attractive. He thinks that ill-looking men should be knocked on the head at once. So Sir Walter would rather like the less physically attractive part of his world to be murdered. And Mrs. Ferrers wants to kill off superannuated servants who cost her a lot of money each year. Even wonderful Eleanor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility for one moment wishes for the death of another human being. When Willoughby is telling her his story on that late night visit to the home of the Palmers, Eleanor, we hear, for a moment wished Willoughby a widower. I think Jane Austen is aware that even very fine and very moral characters can sometimes wish for the death of another human being. Jane Austen in her fiction also looks at something called self-murder. This is better known to us today as suicide, but in Jane Austen's era it was considered a terrible crime. If you took your own life, you were depriving the king of one of his subjects, one of his possessions, if you like. That was a crime. Also, you were, of course, taking a life that belonged to God. So taking one's own life was seen as a very heinous offence indeed. Throughout Jane Austen's life, anyone who committed suicide could not be buried in consecrated ground. They were buried at the crossroads, sometimes with a stake through their hearts. It was felt that the cross formed by the joining of the roads would help the poor afflicted person, and that the tramp of feet and carriages passing overhead would help to keep down a restless spirit. Jane Austen again writes in her juvenilia of suicide in Frederick and Elfrida. A young lady takes her own life by drowning in a stream. There again it is for comic purposes. But in Sense and Sensibility she comes much closer to somebody committing that terrible deed. Marianne Dashwood admits to her sister Eleanor, after all of her histrionic behaviour over Mr. Willoughby and her refusal to eat proper food or take care of herself, and she says to her sister, "Had I died, it would have been self-destruction." It's a powerful moment in that wonderful novel. Jane Austen was aware of the punishments for murder. Hangings were public events, placards advertised them as interesting spectacles for people to go and watch. Jane Austen herself visited a jail. As she travelled around the English countryside, she would have seen the gibbets that were used for hanging, sometimes with rotting corpses in iron cages still dangling there. Definitely not an attractive sight. So Jane Austen was very aware of murder. Sometimes in her early writings she jokes about it, but as always in her fiction she never wastes a word, and when she does make a reference to murder, you know that she is doing so for a very good reason.